The conference room smelled like carpet cleaner and recycled air. My father was already seated when I walked in. His hands were flat on the table, palms down, like a man bracing for something. His attorney leaned over and said something into his ear. My father nodded. He still had not looked at me. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this started. My name is Dana Halverson. I was 34 years old when this happened, and I worked as a wildland firefighter, GS6, on the Flathead Hotshot crew out of Kalispell, Montana. We were a 20-person crew. In a bad fire year, we spent more than 100 days away from home, sometimes well more than that. I had been doing the job for 11 years. I started as a seasonal on a hand crew at 23, worked through the ranks, and tested for the hotshot crew at 27. The qualifying test is 4 miles with a 45-pound pack in under 45 minutes. I did it in 41. I have run it in under 43 every year since. I mention that not to impress you, but because it matters later, the kind of person who trains for that test. People ask what the work is like. I usually say, physical and very clear. Fire moves in a direction. You study the terrain, study the weather, make a decision, and work. I was good at it because I had grown up with that kind of thinking. My grandmother raised me to be methodical about things that mattered. Her name was Ruth Halverson, my mother's mother. She had a property outside of Polson, on the south end of Flathead Lake. 40 acres, a house, a barn, and a view of the water that I had been looking at since I was 4 years old. She kept 6 blue enamel camp mugs on her kitchen shelf, ones she had bought in the 1980s. And every morning I came to visit, she would have one filled and waiting on the counter before I even got to the door. I never had to ask for a single thing in that house. My father was Ray Halverson, divorced from my mother for 22 years. He had remarried, moved to Billings, started an auto parts business with my younger brother Kyle. Kyle was 28. He had always been my father's easier child. He laughed at the right moments and did not ask hard questions and operated on the assumption that being family meant you were automatically on the same side. For a long time, I did not think that was a flaw. I had no reason to think anything was wrong. That was the problem. The fall before any of this happened, my grandmother turned 81. I drove down from Kalispell in October, between fire seasons, and we spent the weekend doing very little. She needed the gutters cleared and the storm windows carried up from the basement. I did both without being asked. We ate soup both nights, because that was what she wanted. On the second evening, she asked me to sit with her on the back porch, and we watched the light go off Flathead Lake the way it does in October, gold and then gray and then gone. She said, without turning to look at me, quote, 0. I did not say anything back. That was the right call. She would have been annoyed by anything sentimental. She had told me years before that the property was mine in her will. Not as an announcement, more the way she said anything important, in passing, while doing something else. We had been cleaning out the barn one summer, and she handed me a hay rake and said, quote one. That was the whole conversation. She handed me the rake and we went back to work. I want to be clear about something. I was not thinking about money. I was thinking about the blue enamel mug on the counter, the smell of pine and lake water in the mornings, the only place in my life where I had ever been able to sleep through the night without waking at 2 in the morning, going over things, off-season. My life was simple. I kept a 1-bedroom apartment in Kalispell with a window that faced the Whitefish Range. I ran 6 miles in the mornings. I had a side table I had been building in pieces for 3 years that never quite got finished. I paid my bills and maintained my gear and showed up every April ready to work. The property in Polson was the only place I thought of as home in the full sense of the word. My father and Kyle knew about the property. I did not think they wanted it. My father had grown up there and left at 18, and I had never heard him mention missing it once in my life. Kyle had visited a handful of times and found it too quiet. They had Billings. They had the business. They had each other. I want to tell you about the last genuinely good evening I had with my father. When I made Hotshot Crew, he drove up from Billings to take me to dinner. He ordered a steak. He told me he had always known I could do anything I set my mind to. And even knowing he was the kind of man who said that about things he had not always entirely believed, I let myself take it that night. Kyle was there too. We ordered dessert. My father paid without looking at the bill, the way he did when he was proud of something. I had not thought about that dinner in years. I thought about it constantly afterward. There were things I explained away that I should not have explained away. In April, my father called and asked, very casually, whether I had thought much about what would happen to the property after Grandma Ruth was gone. I said her arrangements were already in order. He said, "Right, of course." Then he asked whether I knew if she had updated anything recently with her attorney. I said I didn't know. I did not ask why he was asking. I filed it as an odd question and kept moving. In May, Kyle texted to say Grandma Ruth had a new doctor in Polson and had been having some memory trouble. He sent a photo of her in her garden. She was smiling. She looked entirely herself to me. I told him to keep me posted. He said he would. My fire deployment that summer started on the 17th of July. A complex in eastern Oregon, 3 fires merged and running in 70-mile-an-hour gusts. We were out for 23 days straight. No cell service. No outside world. You work until you can't. You sleep 4 hours. You work again. The fire line is the only reality when you are out there. I found out later that while I was on that line, my father was already making calls. I came off rotation on August 9th. I was back in Kalispell by mid-afternoon. I showered, slept 8 hours, and turned my phone on for the first time in 3 weeks. 14 missed calls, 6 from Kyle, 4 from my father, 2 from an unknown number, 2 from a woman named Carol Pierce, my grandmother's neighbor, who I had known for most of my life and who had never once called me before. I called Carol first. Something in the ordering told me to. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was careful in the way voices get when the news has been sitting a while and the person delivering it has had time to arrange it. She said she was so sorry. She said my grandmother had passed on the 28th of July. 11 days before. While I was on the fire line, my hands went cold. Not from the temperature, just cold, like something had quietly rerouted. I sat on the edge of my bed in my clean clothes, and I did the math. 11 days. The funeral would have already happened. Everything would have already happened. Not one person on that call list had left a voicemail. I called Kyle. He answered on the first ring, which told me he had been waiting. He opened with, "I'm so sorry, we tried to reach you," and there is a version of that sentence that is genuine and a version that is cover, and his was the second one. I asked when the funeral had been. He said the 31st. I asked why nobody had contacted my crew supervisor to relay a family emergency message. There is a protocol for that. I had given my father the name and direct number of my crew superintendent years ago, specifically so something like this would not happen. Kyle said they had not been sure of the process. I moved past it. I asked about the will. The pause lasted about 4 seconds. That is a long time on a phone call when you are paying attention. Kyle said our grandmother had updated her arrangements in June, that the property and the savings account were now part of a family trust, that the trust was controlled by our father, as executor. I asked, when was it updated? He said, June 14th. I had spoken to my grandmother on June 10th. She had been completely herself. She told me she was thinking about repainting the barn. She asked me about my July rotation schedule. A woman discussing barn paint on the 10th had, according to my brother, rewritten her entire estate 4 days later. I asked Kyle to explain how that had happened. He said the attorney had confirmed it was her clear decision, freely made. Then he said she had been concerned that the property would not be properly managed. That last sentence was a partial justification and a precise insult delivered in one breath. I noted it and kept going. I asked about the house specifically, whether it had been listed. He said they had a buyer under contract. The house had been put on the market while I was on the fire line. While I was in Eastern Oregon with no phone, the property I had been told was mine had been listed and was under contract. And then I asked about the savings account balance. Another pause. He said it was around $14,000. I knew that account. I had helped my grandmother open it 7 years before. At that time, it had held $41,000. She had been careful with money her entire life. She had not been spending on anything extravagant. There was no clear reason that account should be $27,000 lighter. I did not say that out loud. I filed it. I asked Kyle one last thing. I asked if he had known, back in April, when my father asked me about the attorney, that any of this was already being arranged. He said, "It wasn't like that." I hung up. 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text from my father's number. 7 words. Underscore underscore. Quote underscore 6 underscore underscore. I read it twice. My hands were still cold. The text told me something useful. It told me they were afraid. You do not send a message like that to someone you have already neutralized. You send it to someone you are trying to contain. That was the moment I stopped being upset. I started being methodical. They had no idea what they had just done, and I was going to let them keep not knowing. For a while. I want to be clear about where I was at that point. I had been home for less than 4 hours. My deployment bag was still by the door, unpacked. I had not eaten since that morning. I was sitting on my bed holding a phone with 7 words on the screen. And here is something 11 years of wildland firefighting teaches you. Panic is wasted movement. Your first instinct is not your most useful instinct. The most useful thing is to sit still long enough to see the whole shape of the problem before you do anything at all. I did not have the whole shape yet. What I was about to find out would change my understanding of everything that had already happened. Starting with a specific date on a document. And a name I did not recognize. The first call I made the next morning was to Carol Pierce. She lived a quarter mile down the road from my grandmother's property, in a yellow house with a metal roof I had been able to see from the back porch my entire childhood. She was 73. She had lived next to my grandmother for 31 years. She kept a garden and drove a 12-year-old Subaru and had a way of saying difficult things very plainly that I had always appreciated. I asked if we could meet in person. She said, "I was hoping you would call." I drove down to Polson that same day. 4 hours south on Highway 93, through the reservation, past the south end of the lake. I did not stop. I parked in Carol's gravel driveway at 2 in the afternoon. She was already on the porch. She made coffee and set it on the kitchen table, and then she said, quote, 8. She went to the back of the house and came back with a white envelope. Sealed. My name written on the front in my grandmother's handwriting. Carol said my grandmother had given it to her in May. She said to hold it. She said, "If anything happens, and Dana doesn't already know about it, give it to her." I held the envelope for a moment before I opened it. My grandmother's handwriting was small and even, the way it always was. The letter was 1 page. Dated May 22nd. She wrote that she had been talking with my father about the property, and that he had told her I was not interested in keeping the land, that I had told him I would rather have my share in cash, that the property was too far from my work in Kalispell, and I had no real use for it. She wrote that she was going to update her arrangements to reflect that. She wrote, quote, 10. I read that paragraph twice. I put the letter on the table and looked at Carol. Carol looked back at me. Quote, 11, she said. Quote, 12. I had not told my father anything of the kind. Not once in my life had I said I didn't want the property. The opposite was true, and my father knew it. He had been inside that house. He had watched me sit on that porch. He had sat across from me at dinner in Kalispell the year I made Hotshot Crew, and I had talked about Grandma Ruth's place the way you talk about the only thing that has ever felt entirely safe, and he had listened and nodded and paid for the meal without looking at the bill. He had used what he knew about me to build a lie that my grandmother would believe. The cold thing behind my sternum from the night before got quieter and more specific. I drove back to Kalispell that evening with the letter in my bag and Carol's phone number saved in my contacts, and a referral she had written on a notepad page for an attorney named Margaret Ostrowski, who practiced elder law out of an office on Main Street in Kalispell. 22 years in practice. Carol had used her for her own estate planning. She said, "Margaret does not waste words." That turned out to be accurate. Margaret Ostrowski was 61, with gray hair cut very short and reading glasses she wore on a cord around her neck. Her office had 2 windows and smelled like coffee and old paper. She read the letter without any expression at all. Then she set it on the desk and looked at me over her glasses. She said, "Tell me the whole thing from the beginning. Don't leave anything out." I did. It took 40 minutes. She did not interrupt once. When I was done, she said, "The will change is the obvious target, but I want to see the power of attorney documents first. Get me the county recorder's records for that property. Get me anything you can find about the estate attorney who handled the June revision, and find out when the house was listed." She said, "Do not contact your father or your brother again. Do not respond to anything. Can you do that?" I said yes. She said, "Good, then let's get to work." I started with the county recorder's office. Montana property records are public. You can pull them yourself if you know where to look. I had been navigating government databases my entire career: Forest Service fire records, incident command documentation, federal human resources systems. This was not complicated. I pulled the listing record for my grandmother's property in Polson in about 20 minutes. The house had been listed on June 11th. I need you to understand what that date meant. The will revision was dated June 14th, 3 days later. The property had been put on the market on June 11th, when the estate still legally reflected my grandmother's original arrangements. My father had listed a property he did not yet have legal authority to sell. He had done it before the ink was dry on the document he was using to justify doing it. And then I pulled the power of attorney records, and I saw the date, and I had to sit down. My father had been granted financial power of attorney over my grandmother's accounts in February, 4 months before the will change, 4 months before she passed. I had known nothing about this. The original will attorney, a man named Donald Severs who had handled my grandmother's affairs for 19 years, had not prepared that document. A different attorney had. The same attorney who had driven up from Billings in June to handle the will revision. My father's business attorney. I called Donald Severs. He picked up on the third ring, and when I said my grandmother's name, his voice shifted in a way that told me he had been expecting this call for some time. He said he had been removed from her representation in March. He said my grandmother had called him herself to tell him. Her voice, he said, sounded careful, like she was reading from notes. He had tried to schedule a follow-up call and the number had redirected to my father's cell phone. He said, "I want you to know I have been uncomfortable about this since March." He was not going to volunteer anything further without a formal process. I understood that, but I had what I needed. Margaret pulled the savings account records through the estate discovery process once we filed. 7 withdrawals between March and June. The account had held $41,260 in February. It held $14,040 at the time of my grandmother's death. $27,220, gone in 4 months, withdrawn by my father under the power of attorney he had arranged in February, before he had finished telling my grandmother that I did not want the property. He had been moving money out of that account before he had fully built the story he needed to change the will. A settlement offer came in 3 weeks after we filed. My father's attorney called Margaret. and offered $8,000 and a transfer of some personal items from the property. Margaret relayed it to me without editorializing. I told her to decline. She asked if I wanted to think about it overnight. I said no. She said, "Okay," in a tone that suggested she had not expected a different answer. But here's what none of them knew. Carol had kept something else, not just the letter. My grandmother had called her on the evening of June 13th, the day before the will revision was signed. Carol had written down the date and time in a small notebook she kept by her phone, a habit from her years working as a church secretary. My grandmother had said she was signing papers tomorrow with Ray's attorney and she was not entirely sure about all of it, but Ray had explained it was what Dana wanted and she trusted her son. Carol had asked if she wanted to call Dana first to confirm. My grandmother had said Ray told her Dana was already on a fire rotation and completely unreachable. I had not started my rotation until July 17th. On June 13th, I had been in my apartment in Kalispell. My phone had been on. My number had not changed in 6 years. Wait, it gets worse. Margaret's paralegal ran a civil court search on my father's name going back 20 years. There was a filing from 11 years before in Yellowstone County. A disputed estate matter involving a woman named Harriet Combs. Harriet Combs was the mother of my father's first wife. The filing alleged undue influence in a property transfer. The case had been settled out of court. The records were partially sealed, but the initial filing was public, and the pattern of conduct described in that complaint read like a rough draft of exactly what had happened to my grandmother. He had done this before. This was not the first time. Margaret went very quiet when I walked that document into her office. I watched her read it twice. She set it on the desk next to Carol's letter. She looked at both of them for a moment without speaking. Then she looked up at me and said, "They are going to come into that conference room thinking this is a negotiation." I said I understood. She said, "I want you to let me lead for most of it." I said, "Most of it." She looked at me for a second. Then she said, "Fine, most of it." I had one meeting left. I want to pause here for a moment, because I have been asked, in the time since, whether I was angry going into that room. And the honest answer is that what I felt was not exactly anger. Anger is hot, and it moves around. What I felt was more like alignment. Like a very long calculation had finally finished running, and the answer was sitting right there, clear and complete. I had the letter. I had the listing date. I had the power of attorney timeline. I had Carol's notebook. I had Donald Seaver's. I had the Yellowstone County filing. I had an attorney who did not waste words. Everything I had done for the past 2 months had been preparation for one room, one table, one conversation. Margaret had told me to let her lead. I told her I understood. And I did understand. I just also knew that there was one moment, one specific exchange, when I was going to speak directly to my father. One sentence. I had been thinking about it for 6 weeks. I knew exactly when to say it. I knew exactly what his face was going to do. I had been reading that face my entire life. We pulled into the parking garage at 8:47 in the morning. I remember checking the time. Margaret Ostrowski's conference room was on the 3rd floor of a building on Main Street, 2 blocks from the county courthouse. The room had a long oak table, 8 chairs, and 2 windows that faced north toward the mountains. The carpet was the color of old moss. There was a water pitcher in the center of the table that nobody ever touched. I noticed all of this in about 4 seconds, which is a habit from the job. You read a space before you need to move through it. My father and his attorney were already seated when Margaret and I walked in. His attorney was a man named Garrett Fitch from Billings, in a gray suit that fit him well. My father was in a collared shirt, dark blue, the kind he wore to things he considered important. Kyle was not there. I had not expected him to be. My father looked up when I came through the door. His expression did something small and complicated, and then he arranged it back into neutral. I sat down across from him. I set my bag on the floor. I folded my hands on the table. I was wearing my grandmother's watch. It was a simple thing, a small gold face on a brown leather strap, 40 years old. Nothing expensive. I had found it in a box of personal items that had been set aside during the estate process. I had not told anyone I was going to wear it. I just wore it. Garrett Fitch opened by summarizing the estate revision and the power of attorney documentation and the legitimacy of the June transfer. He spoke for about 8 minutes. His voice was even and professionally warm. He made it sound like a story about a family that had communicated clearly and acted in good faith throughout. My father nodded twice during the summary. He had the posture of a man who had already decided how this meeting ended. Margaret listened without expression. I watched the table. Garrett Fitch said the settlement offer of $8,000 remained available and that his client was prepared to discuss the personal property inventory in addition. He set a one-page summary on the table and slid it toward Margaret. Margaret did not pick it up. She said, Quote 25. She opened her folder. I did not reach for mine yet. She laid down the county recorder's listing date first, June 11th, 2 days before the will revision was signed. Garrett Fitch looked at it. His expression did not change, but he picked it up with both hands, and that told me something. Margaret laid down the power of attorney registration. February. 4 months before the will change. Then she laid down the savings account withdrawal record. 7 transactions. $27,220. My father's hands, which had been flat on the table when I walked in, moved to his lap. Then I opened my folder. I took out Carol's letter, the original, in my grandmother's handwriting. I did not say anything. I opened it and put it on the table and pushed it toward the center. The room went quiet in a specific way. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something else, something careful and held. Garrett Fitch read it. He read it once quickly and then again more slowly. My father did not reach for it. He was looking at the window. Margaret laid down Carol's notebook entry next. June 13th. My grandmother's voice, careful, like she was reading from notes. Ray told her Dana was already on a fire rotation and completely unreachable. My father's jaw shifted, just slightly. Then Margaret placed the Yellowstone County filing on the table. Harriet Combs, 11 years before, undue influence property transfer, settled out of court. Garrett Fitch set down the document he was holding. He looked at my father. My father was still looking at the window. Something had left his face. Not guilt exactly, more like the specific expression of a man who has run a calculation and arrived at a number he doesn't like. Garrett Fitch said quietly, quote 26, quote, Margaret said, quote 27, quote. In the 11 minutes that followed, which I know because I was looking at my grandmother's watch, Garrett Fitch and my father had a conversation in the hallway. Margaret and I sat at the table. She poured water from the pitcher. I did not move. When my father came back in, he sat down and looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at me, directly, for the first time since I had walked in. I said, I know about Harriet Combs. One sentence. No raised voice. I had been carrying it for 6 weeks, and when I finally said it, it felt like setting something down. My father looked at me for a long time without speaking. Then he looked back at the table. Margaret said, I think we're ready to talk about a real number. The property was under contract for $208,000. The buyer was still in the purchase window. The agreement we reached that morning included the full proceeds of the sale, the remaining balance of the savings account, and a formal written acknowledgement that the June will revision had been executed under materially false pretenses. Garrett Fitch drafted the language himself, in that room, in about 40 minutes. My father signed it without reading it twice. The room was very quiet after. Outside, through the north-facing windows, I could see a strip of sky above the mountain line. Someone's phone buzzed on the table, and nobody moved to answer it. I took the stairs down instead of the elevator. In the parking garage, I stood next to Margaret's car for a minute. The concrete was cold and smelled like exhaust and dust. I pressed my back against the car door and looked at the ceiling of the garage, and I breathed in and out 4 times, slowly, the way you do when you have been in smoke all day and you finally step back into clean air. Margaret came out 2 minutes later. She looked at me and said, "You did that well." I said, "You did most of it." She said, "You did the hard part. The hard part was building the case before you had any idea if it would work." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Your grandmother knew who you were." I did not trust myself to say anything back, so I just nodded. She got in the car. I got in the car. We drove out of the garage and back onto Main Street, and the mountains were completely clear to the north, and the sky was the particular blue it gets in Montana in October when the air has no smoke in it at all. Kyle called me 3 weeks after the settlement. I had not reached out. The call came on a Tuesday evening while I was making dinner, and I looked at the name on the screen for a long moment before I answered. He said he was sorry. I waited. He said he hadn't known about the Harriet Combs situation. He said he hadn't known about the savings account withdrawals. He said he had believed our father when our father told him I wanted out of the property. I said, "Did you try to reach me during my rotation to confirm?" He was quiet. I said, "There is a protocol. You had my superintendent's number. I had given it to Dad years ago." He said, "I should have checked." That was the most honest thing he said in the whole conversation. I gave him credit for it. But honesty about a thing and accountability for a thing are two different distances, and we did not close the second one. The call lasted 9 minutes. We have not spoken since. I do not know if we will. The Civil Attorney General's office opened a separate review of my father's conduct in the Harriet Combs matter after Margaret filed a referral. I am not at liberty to say more than that, other than that the matter was not closed. My father has not contacted me. The 97 missed calls came in over 48 hours, starting the morning after the settlement documents were signed, and his buyer learned the contract structure had changed. I watched them come in. I watched them stop. There is one more thing I haven't told you yet. My grandmother's letter, the one Carol kept, had a second paragraph I have not mentioned. After the part about what my father had told her, after the line about doing what Dana wanted, she wrote, "I keep her grandmother's watch in the nightstand drawer. I want her to have it. It was my mother's first, then mine, now hers. She will know what to do with it." She had written that in May, months before she passed. The watch was in the nightstand drawer when the estate inventory was taken, and because it was personal property and not real property, it had not been contested, and it had come to me in a box with some books and a folded tablecloth. I wear it most days. Not every day. On the days when I need to sit across a table from something difficult and stay very still, I wear it. It is on my wrist right now. 18 months out, my life is specific and small and mine. I finished the side table. It is in the corner of my living room, and it is not entirely level, but I like it anyway. I run 6 miles in the mornings. I am 2 months out from my next fire season, and my pack weight is exactly where I want it. I sleep through the night now. I kept one of the blue enamel camp mugs. Carol had rescued 2 of them from the kitchen before the house was cleared. She mailed one to me wrapped in a kitchen towel with a note that said, "I thought you should have this. I use it every morning." It holds coffee and it holds something else, a specific weight in both hands that I cannot name, but that I am not interested in putting down. What I learned from this is not what I expected to learn. I expected to learn something about protecting yourself legally or about trusting people less. What I actually learned is more specific. I learned that the people who deceive you almost always use your own values as the mechanism. They knew I trusted my grandmother's judgment. They knew she trusted family. They knew I was trained to stay calm and not react. They built a lie out of everything they understood about us. And the only reason it didn't work is because my grandmother left a letter with a neighbor in May, in case. She was 81 years old, and she left a letter with a neighbor in case. She did not know exactly what she was afraid of, but she was afraid of something, and she prepared anyway. She raised me to do the same thing. It turns out she practiced what she taught. The morning after the settlement, I drove south on Highway 93, through the reservation, past the south end of Flathead Lake. I parked at the edge of the road where you can see the back of the property through the trees. The house had new owners. The lights were on. Somewhere in there, in the mornings, someone would stand at that kitchen counter. I sat in the truck for a while. Then I drove back to Kalispell. The blue enamel mug was on my counter when I got home. I made coffee and put it on the window ledge and watched the Whitefish Range go from gray to gold in the early light, the way it does in Montana when the air is clean and the season has not started yet, and everything is still possible. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, I would want to know about it in the comments. And if you want to know what the County Review turned up 6 months later, that story is still going.